The gun was already pressed against Abraham Trask's chest when Jane Hawthorne finally said the words she had been swallowing for 3 weeks. "You lied to me." Her voice did not shake. That was the terrible part. After everything that had happened, after the fire and the betrayal and the long dark ride across the New Mexico territory with nothing but dust and grief and the sound of horses breathing, her voice was perfectly, horrifyingly steady. She stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office in Redemption, New Mexico, the year 1883, with the late October wind pulling at the hem of her brown traveling dress, and she pointed the Remington pistol she had carried since leaving Missouri directly at the man who had every reason to deserve it. Abraham Trask did not move. He was a tall man, lean in the way that years of hard living made a person lean, with dark eyes that had seen things most people only read about in dime novels, and then closed the covers on, grateful the world in the book was not the world they lived in. He had a jaw that could have been cut from sandstone and hands that were calloused in a way that told you immediately he had never in his life done anything the easy way. He looked at the gun pressed against his sternum, and then he looked at Jane Hawthorne, and something happened in his expression that she had not expected. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had made his peace with it. "I know," he said. Those two words detonated inside her chest like a charge of dynamite. "You know," she repeated, her hand tightening on the grip of the pistol. "You know that you lied to me. You know that you brought me out here under false pretenses, that everything you put in those letters, everything you promised, was built on a foundation of secrets so dark I would have turned around in St. Louis if I had known even a fraction of it. And all you have to say is, you know." "I have a lot more to say than that," Abraham told her, his voice quiet and rough as gravel under a slow wagon wheel. "But I figured I would let you say what you needed to say first." "Do not do that," Jane said, and for the first time her voice cracked, just barely, like a hairline fracture in good pottery. "Do not stand there being reasonable. I need you to be the monster right now, Abraham. I need you to make this easy." "I know I am not easy," he said. "I have never been easy. There is not a man alive who would argue that point. But Jane, if you will let me, I want to try to be." The wind moved through the town of Redemption like a living thing. A shutter banged somewhere down the main street. A horse tied to the post outside the saloon shifted its weight and blew air through its nose. Jane Hawthorne stood with a gun pressed against the chest of a man who, by every rational measure, she should have already left behind, and she felt herself at the edge of the most consequential decision of her 26 years of life. She did not pull the trigger. She lowered the gun. And 3 weeks of history came rushing back to fill the silence between them. It had started, the way so many things in Jane Hawthorne's life started, with a letter. She had been living in St. Louis, Missouri, in the autumn of 1883, in a boarding house on Chestnut Street run by a woman named Mrs. Portia Dalloway, who believed that clean living and hard work were the twin pillars of a respectable existence, and who charged $12 a month for a room barely large enough to turn around in. Jane had been a school teacher at the Second Ward School for 3 years, teaching the children of factory workers and river men and small merchants how to read and write and understand arithmetic, and she had been good at it. But goodness at a thing does not always save you from the circumstances that surround it. The school board had let her go in September. The stated reason was a reduction in enrollment. The real reason, which every teacher in the building understood with the silent clarity of shared experience, was that the new superintendent believed women teachers became a liability when they remained unmarried past a certain age, because they grew, in his words, independently minded. Jane had been 25 at the time of her dismissal, unmarried, independently minded, and deeply unrepentant about both conditions. She had savings. Not enough savings. She had 3 months at most before Mrs. Dalloway's $12 a month became a number she could not pay, and the positions available to a woman of her education in St. Louis in 1883 were not numerous or generous. She could take in sewing. She could work as a governess for a wealthy family, which would mean trading one form of dependence for another. She could answer one of the matrimonial advertisements that appeared regularly in the back pages of the St. Louis Globe Democrat, the ones placed by men in the territories who needed wives and were willing to pay a woman's passage west if she agreed to come and see whether the arrangement suited her. She had always considered those advertisements to be, if not desperate, then at least a measure of last resort. By October she was at last resort. The advertisement that caught her eye was not the most flowery or the most promising. It was, in fact, almost austerely plain. It read, "Rancher in Redemption, New Mexico Territory, seeking a woman of intelligence and good character to correspond with view to matrimony. Experience with livestock not required. Patience and honesty are. Please write to A. Trask, General Delivery, Redemption, NMT." What she noticed first was the word honesty. It seemed like an unusual thing to advertise for. Most of the matrimonial notices spoke of youth and cooking ability and Christian virtue. This one asked for honesty. It made her curious in a way the others had not. She wrote back. The correspondence that followed across 6 weeks was unlike anything Jane had anticipated. Abraham Trask, whoever he was, wrote the way he apparently did everything else, without ornament and without apology. He did not tell her she was brave for considering the journey west. He did not paint the ranch in colors more flattering than the truth warranted. He told her that Redemption was a small town, that the ranch was 12 miles outside it, that the land was beautiful in a way that required a particular kind of patience to appreciate, and that the work was constant, and the winters were cold, and anyone who came expecting an easy life would be disappointed inside of a month. But he also wrote about the sky. He wrote about it with a specificity that surprised her. The way the stars over the high desert were so bright and so numerous that on clear nights you could read a newspaper by their combined light, which he admitted he had never actually tested, but felt sure was probably true. He wrote about the way the mesa turned the color of old copper at sunset. He wrote about a spring that ran cold and clean at the back of his property, and the way the cottonwood trees along its banks turned gold in autumn, a gold so sharp and so sincere it made you feel that the world was apologizing for something. Jane had not expected to be moved by letters from a strange man in New Mexico, but she was moved, deeply and somewhat against her will. She wrote back and asked him directly, "What are you not telling me?" There was a pause of 10 days before his reply came. When it did, it was shorter than usual and chose its words the way a man crossing a frozen river chose where to put his feet. He told her that he had a complicated history in Redemption, that there were people in the territory who did not think well of him, and that some of their reasons were not without basis. That he was not a man who had always done the right thing, but that he was a man who was trying to make his accounting balance in whatever time he had left to work at it. He told her she deserved to know that before she made any decisions. She had turned that letter over in her hands for 2 days. She had shown it to no one. She had read it until she knew it by heart. And then she had written back and said she appreciated his candor and that she was willing to come and meet him in person, but that if there were things he was still keeping from her, she would rather know them before she arrived than after. She believed in facing things directly. He had written back immediately, by the speed of the reply. He said he agreed with her completely on the matter of facing things directly. He said he would do his best to be honest with her. He said he was looking forward to meeting her, and hoped she would find the territory to her liking. What he did not say, in any of those letters, in any of the careful and sometimes startlingly beautiful words he had sent her over 6 weeks of correspondence, was that his name was not entirely Abraham Trask in the way a clean man's name is his name, without shadow or alternate meaning. He did not say that in certain parts of the territory, in certain older conversations, he had been known by a reputation that had nothing to do with ranching. He did not say that the complicated history he had referenced so carefully was not merely the ordinary complicated history of a man who had made some poor choices in his youth, but was instead the kind of complicated history that involved a man named Cole Devereaux, and a robbery that had happened in 1876, and the fact that two men had been killed that day, and that the question of whose fault that had been was still, 7 years later, not entirely settled. He did not say any of this. And Jane Hawthorne stepped off the southbound stage in Redemption, New Mexico on a Wednesday afternoon in October 1883, into a town that was watching her with far more intensity than a simple matrimonial arrangement should have produced, and she did not know why. She knew something was wrong within the first hour. The woman who ran the Redemption Hotel, a broad-shouldered woman named Helen Foss with shrewd blue eyes and a manner that was not unkind but was extremely watchful, had given Jane her room key, and then held onto Jane's hand a half-second longer than was necessary when Jane reached for it. She had looked at her with an expression that was caught somewhere between pity and warning. "You the one coming to meet Abraham Trask?" Helen Foss had asked, although she clearly already knew the answer. "I am," Jane said. Helen Foss had made a sound in the back of her throat that was not quite agreement and not quite dissent. "He is a good man," she said, and then she seemed to debate something internally before adding, "Now, he is a good man now. That matters, I think. I just thought you should know the word now is doing some work in that sentence." Jane had wanted to ask more, but Helen Foss had clearly said what she was willing to say, and Jane was tired from 2 days on the stage, and she had thought she would wait and ask Abraham directly. She met him the following morning. He came into town early, tying his horse outside the hotel with the particular efficiency of a man who did everything without wasted motion. And when Jane came down the staircase and saw him standing in the lobby with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a gesture she would come to recognize as his primary expression of nervousness, she was struck first by how different he was from what she had constructed in her imagination from his letters. She had imagined someone weathered but gentle-looking, scholarly perhaps, with the kind of face that matched the way he wrote about cottonwood trees and desert skies. What she saw instead was a man who looked like he had argued with the world on numerous occasions and had never quite managed to lose, but had collected evidence of every fight. He had a long scar along his left jaw, faint but unmistakable. He had eyes that were dark and careful and lit from somewhere deep inside by something that might have been intelligence or might have been pain or might have been both in proportion that varied by the hour. He said, "Miss Hawthorne, I am Abraham Trask." And she said, "I know, you look like your letters." And he had stared at her for a moment, clearly uncertain how to receive that, and then the corner of his mouth had moved upward by the smallest possible increment, and something had shifted in the lobby of the Redemption Hotel, something quiet and fundamental, the way the temperature shifts when the season is truly changing, not just teasing at it. They had breakfast at the hotel's dining room. He was honest in person in the same way he was honest in his letters, direct and economical with words but not cold. He asked about her journey and about her work in St. Louis and about what she hoped for in her future, and he listened to the answers with the complete attention of a man who had decided that listening carefully was perhaps the most respectful thing he could offer another person. She asked him about the ranch. He described it plainly. 400 acres in the foothills, a modest but well-built house that he had constructed himself over 3 years, cattle, a kitchen garden that had never quite flourished the way he hoped, 2 ranch hands named Denny and Pio who had worked the property almost as long as he had. He told her the nearest school was in Redemption, and that if she wished to continue teaching once she was settled, he had no objection, that in fact he thought it would suit her and the town could use a good teacher. She noticed how careful he was, not dishonest exactly, but careful. The way a man is careful when he is choosing which truths to offer and in what order. She asked him directly, over the second cup of coffee, what it was that Helen Foss had meant when she said that word now was doing some work in a sentence about him being a good man, The careful quality of him became something else in that moment. It became still, the way the air becomes still before a storm. "What do you know about a man named Cole Devereaux?" he asked, and it was the way he asked it, as if the name were a thing with physical weight, that told her before any explanation did that she was about to hear something significant. She did not know the name. She told him so. He told her then about 1876, about being 22 years old and newly arrived in the territory with nothing but a horse and a willingness to work, and a complete absence of good judgment about the company he kept. About Cole Devereaux, who was charming and magnetic and had a plan that sounded, to a 22-year-old with empty pockets, like the kind of risk that had an acceptable upside. About the stagecoach outside of Santa Fe. About the fact that no one was supposed to get hurt and 2 men had ended up dead anyway, not by Abraham's hand directly, but in a situation Abraham had helped to create. He told her he had done 8 years in the federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas. He told her he had been released 14 months ago. He told her he had come to redemption because it was as far from his history as he could get and still make a life, and that he had built the ranch because building something with your hands was, in his experience, one of the only activities that reliably made the inside of his head quiet enough to be bearable. Jane Hawthorne sat with her coffee cup and listened to all of this and felt the careful architecture of the expectation she had built over 6 weeks of letters rearranging itself around this new and heavier information. She was not afraid of him. That was the first thing she established clearly in her own mind. The story he was telling her was a dark one, and the past it described was genuinely terrible. But the man sitting across from her over a hotel breakfast table was not the same as the 22-year-old he was describing. She could see that. She had spent 3 years teaching children, and she understood with a kind of cellular certainty how much a person could change given time and the right circumstances and the genuine will to do so. But she was angry. That was the second thing she established. She was angry because he had not told her this in the letters. He had hinted at it, had warned her at the edges of it, but he had not said it plainly, and she had come all the way from Missouri to a place where she knew no one, based in part on the correspondence of a man who had deliberately kept the most consequential information about himself in soft focus. She told him she needed the day to think. He nodded and said he understood completely, and that he would be at the same table at the same time the following morning if she wished to continue the conversation, and that if she did not come, he would understand that as well. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed and looked out the window at the main street of Redemption, New Mexico, and tried to determine what she actually felt beneath the anger and the surprise. What she felt, underneath all of it, was curious. And she was honest enough with herself to admit that this was not entirely a rational response to the situation, but she had always found that curiosity was one of the better compasses a person had available, and it was pointing at Abraham Trask with a persistence she could not quite dismiss. She went to dinner that evening at a small restaurant near the hotel, a place run by a Mexican woman named Catalina who made extraordinary chili Colorado, and who, when she learned Jane was the woman come to meet Abraham Trask, set down the serving bowl and looked at her with an expression of such complex feeling that Jane asked her to please just say what was on her mind. Catalina said, "He saved my son's life 2 months ago. My son Mateo, he fell from the roof of the house and Abraham was riding past and he saw it happen and he got down and he rode 12 miles in under an hour to bring the doctor back. He stayed the whole night. He did not leave until Mateo was out of danger." She paused and picked up the serving bowl again. "I just think you should know that." Jane thought about that for a long time over the chili Colorado. She thought about the man who had helped plan a robbery at 22, and the man who had ridden 12 miles in the dark for someone else's child. She thought about the letters and the way they had been honest in everything except the one most important thing. She thought about Helen Foss and the word now doing its work. She thought about what it meant to judge a person by the whole of them rather than by the worst of them, and she thought about what it meant to trust her own judgment in a place far from home with very little margin for error. When she went down to the hotel dining room the next morning, Abraham was already there. He looked like he had not slept, which she suspected was accurate. He stood up when she came in, which was a small courtesy that she noticed, and he waited to see what she was going to do. She sat down across from him and said, "I have conditions." He sat back down. Something in his face became attentive in a way that was almost reverent. "First," she said, "you tell me everything, not just the parts you have already decided I can handle, everything. I will determine what I can handle myself." He nodded. "Second," she said, "we take this slowly. I am not agreeing to marry you today. I am agreeing to stay in redemption for a reasonable period and see whether this can become something real. If it cannot, I will need my return passage to St. Louis paid." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "Third," she said, "if there is anyone in this territory who means you harm because of your past, I need to know that too. I will not walk into a danger I have not been warned about." The look that crossed his face then was complicated and swift, like a cloud shadow crossing the desert floor. "There is something I need to tell you about that," he said. And that was how she learned about Cole Devereaux being released from his own imprisonment 6 weeks prior, and about the letter Abraham had received 3 weeks before Jane arrived. A letter that contained no direct threat, but that was written in the manner of a man who considered a certain debt unpaid. Cole Devereaux, it seemed, had a particular view of the events of 1876. His view was that Abraham had cooperated too extensively with the federal marshals during the investigation, which was true in the sense that Abraham had answered every question put to him honestly, and that this cooperation had resulted in Cole Devereaux receiving a longer sentence than he might otherwise have received. Cole Devereaux had apparently spent several years of that sentence refining his feelings about this into something quite sharp. Jane absorbed this information and thought that any reasonable person in her position would at this point thank Abraham Trask for his hospitality and purchase a stage ticket back to St. Louis. She did not do this. She was not always a reasonable person, in the sense that reasons did not always govern the directions her heart moved in. She had always been led by something more direct and more demanding than pure logic, something that looked like instinct but ran deeper. And that deep running thing was telling her, in a voice that was quiet but very clear, that this man across the table from her in the hotel dining room was worth the trouble he came with. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. His face did something she had not seen it do yet. It opened, like a window in a room that had been shut up too long. Over the following 2 weeks, Jane Hawthorne made herself at home in redemption with the efficient purposefulness of a woman who had learned early that adaptation was a survival skill. She borrowed a horse from the hotel's stable arrangement and rode out to the ranch 3 times in that fortnight, learning the land by sight and smell, and the particular way her body felt in the saddle after an hour of high desert riding. Muscles she had not used in years, awakening with the focused complaint of the long neglected. The ranch was exactly as Abraham had described it. The house was modest, constructed of adobe and timber, with deep-set windows that kept the interior cool in the heat of the day, and a covered porch that faced west to catch the sunset. The kitchen was functional and clean. There was a bedroom, a small sitting room with a good stone fireplace, a room Abraham had designated as a library though its shelves held only 20 or so books, and a second room that he had built on the back of the house when he first purchased the property, which he told her had been intended for whatever the future required. He showed her the property with a quiet pride that was not boastful but was genuine, the pride of a man who had built something from nothing with his own 2 hands and knew exactly what that had cost him. The 2 ranch hands, Denny Burrows and Pio Salazar, were both in their 30s and both treated her with a careful, considered courtesy that told her Abraham had spoken to them before her first visit. Denny was a red-faced, quietly funny man from Texas, who communicated primarily through implication and the strategic raising of one eyebrow. Pio was Mexican-born, deeply competent, and had a kindness to him that operated without announcement, the kind that showed up in small actions: a gate opened before you reached it, a cup of water left at the right moment. She observed Abraham with his ranch hands and his horses and his land, and what she saw was consistent with what she had heard from Catalina and seen in the hotel dining room. He was demanding but fair. He was not easy, exactly. She could see that immediately and clearly. He was a man with a complicated internal weather system that not everyone would want to navigate. He had moods that went quiet and deep in a way that required the people around him to simply accept the quiet without demanding explanation. He had strong opinions and the particular stubbornness of a person who had learned through hard experience that his own judgment, when he trusted it properly, was generally sound. He was not an easy man to know, but he was a man worth knowing. She was increasingly certain of that. On her third visit to the ranch, she had arrived to find him at the back property line near the spring, doing a repair on the fence that ran along that border, and she had tied her horse and walked through the cottonwoods to where he was working, and she had watched him for a moment before he noticed her. The afternoon light was extraordinary, that copper-gold color he had described in his letters, and the cottonwood leaves were exactly the sharp apologetic gold he had written about, and she had stood there in that light and felt something settle inside her the way sediment settles in still water, gently and without drama, into a new and permanent arrangement. He had looked up and seen her watching him and had not been startled, which she had come to understand was characteristic. He absorbed things rather than reacting to them, which was either a sign of great self-possession or great damage, and she suspected in his case it was some particular combination of both. "The fence needed mending," he said. "I can see that," she said. They stood in the cottonwood light for a moment saying nothing, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Jane had ever occupied with another person. "I like this place," she told him. "I want you to know that. Whatever I decide about the rest of it, I like this place." He set down the wire stretcher he had been using and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. "The rest of it," he said. "Meaning me." "Meaning all of it," she said. "Meaning the fact that there is a man somewhere in this territory who is angry at you and apparently considers that your responsibility. Meaning the fact that you are not an easy person. Meaning the fact that you kept important things from me in your letters, and I am still deciding how I feel about that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it is worth, I kept those things because I was afraid. Not of you finding out. I knew you would find out. I was afraid that if I said it all at once in a letter, before you had any sense of who I was beneath it, you would see only the worst of it, and you would be making a decision based on the worst of me rather than the whole of me." She looked at him steadily. "That is a very understandable reason," she said. "It is also a form of manipulation." "Yes," he agreed, and she thought this was one of the most honest syllables she had ever heard a person produce. "I appreciate that you are not arguing the point," she said. "I do not think arguing it would serve either of us," he said, and then very quietly, "I am sorry, Jane." She believed him. It was that evening, riding back toward redemption in the darkening light, that she became aware she was not alone on the road. The man who pulled alongside her from a side trail was not someone she had seen before, but something about him produced an immediate and specific alarm in her, the way an animal raises its head at a sound that hasn't yet resolved into language. He was perhaps 40, sandy-haired and pleasant-looking in a way that was deliberately cultivated, and he rode with the ease of someone who spent a great deal of time on horseback and did not think much about it. He tipped his hat. "Evening," he said. "You would be Miss Hawthorne." "The woman come from Missouri to meet Abraham Trask." "I would," Jane said, keeping her voice neutral and her hand where it could reach the Remington pistol she carried in the bag at her saddle. "And you are Cole Devereaux," he said, and smiled with a pleasantness that did not reach the level of his eyes. "I expect Abraham has mentioned me." Every nerve in Jane's body went a high alert. She kept her face composed with an effort that cost her considerably. "He has," she said. "All bad things, I imagine," Cole Devereaux said, still in that pleasant tone. "He always was a good storyteller, Abraham, made himself the hero of everything. It is a talent." "What do you want, Mr. Devereaux?" Jane asked. He rode alongside her in silence for a moment, looking ahead at the road as if they were having a perfectly ordinary conversation. "I want you to understand something about the man you have come all this way to marry," he said. "I want you to understand that Abraham Trask is not the reformed man he has presented himself as. He is a man who made a choice in 1876 that cost me 7 years of my life, and who has been living in comfortable obscurity ever since while I paid the full price for a venture we both undertook." "That is a particular interpretation of events," Jane said carefully. Something shifted in Devereaux's pleasant manner. "Not much, just enough." "He told you I am dangerous," Devereaux said. "I expect he did. It is the kind of thing a man says when he wants to make sure the people around him are already disposed to see his enemy in the worst possible light." He paused. "I am not going to hurt you, Miss Hawthorne. I want to be very clear about that. You have nothing to fear from me. What I want is for Abraham Trask to face a reckoning that he has thus far managed to avoid. And I thought you should know that before you committed yourself to a life built on top of his secrets." He slowed his horse and let her pull ahead. She rode the rest of the way to Redemption at a pace. She forced herself to keep steady rather than urgent. And when she arrived, she went directly to the sheriff's office. The sheriff of Redemption was a man named Orville Crane, who was competent and unsentimental, and had a deputy named Harris who was neither of those things. Sheriff Crane listened to what Jane told him about her encounter on the road, and then looked at her with the expression of a man calculating several things simultaneously. "Cole Devereaux has not done anything I can hold him on," Sheriff Crane said. "He has not made a direct threat. He is a free man who has served his time and has as much right to be in this territory as anyone else." "I understand that," Jane said. "I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to be aware that he is here and that he has approached me in a way I found concerning." "I am aware," the sheriff said. "I have been aware since he rode into town 4 days ago. I am keeping my eye on him. And I would suggest," he added, looking at her directly, "that you keep yours on him too." She went back to the hotel and wrote Abraham a note, which she gave to the hotel boy to ride out with in the morning. The note said only, "Devereaux has arrived. He spoke to me on the road tonight. I think we need to talk. He was at the hotel before 8 in the morning." The conversation that followed was the most honest one they had had yet, which was saying something. Abraham did not hedge or minimize or express any of the defensive justifications that Jane had halfway expected. He sat across from her in the hotel dining room with his hat on the table beside him, and told her the complete version of what had happened in 1876, not the careful abbreviated version he had offered before, but the whole and unedited account. He had been 22, and he had been foolish in the way that young men with nothing and no one are sometimes foolish, drawn to the confidence of a man like Cole Devereaux the way a moth is drawn to a lamp. Devereaux had planned the stage robbery with the specific and detailed precision of a man who had done it before, which he had. Abraham had been the outrider, the one who stopped the stage on the road while 2 other men came in from either side. When the driver had gone for the shotgun, Devereaux had acted faster than the plan had allowed for, and 2 men were dead before anyone had time to recalibrate. Abraham had not fired either shot. He had, however, been present. He had been complicit in the creation of the situation that made those deaths possible. He had testified honestly to everything he had witnessed. And yes, his testimony had been comprehensive enough that Cole Devereaux had received the maximum possible sentence. He had regretted the deaths every day of his 8 years at Leavenworth. He regretted them still. He would not pretend otherwise and would not offer justifications that excused his part in what had happened. Jane listened to all of this and felt the weight of it settle over the table between them like something physical. "The reckoning he said you have avoided," she said. "What do you think he means by that?" "I think he means that he believes I owe him something for testifying," Abraham said. "And I think whatever form he intends to extract it in, it is not going to be a conversation." "Are you afraid of him?" Jane asked. Abraham considered the question with the seriousness she had come to expect from him. "I am cautious," he said. "Devereux is not careless. He does not act without a plan, and that makes him more dangerous than someone who simply goes at things with anger. Whatever he is here to do, he has already thought it through." "Then we should think it through ahead of him," Jane said. He looked at her then with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the look of a man recalibrating an expectation he had not realized he was carrying. "We," he said. "We," she confirmed. "I have not made my final decision about the rest of it, but I have made my decision about this. I am not going back to St. Louis because a man with a grudge came riding into town. That is not who I am." Abraham was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had a quality to it that she had not heard before, something rougher and more unguarded than his usual careful delivery. "I know I am not easy," he said. "I know what I am asking of you, coming here and walking into all of this, and I know that you had no way of knowing what you were walking into when you wrote that first letter. I know I am not easy, Jane, but you make me want to try to be." The honesty of it was like an open window in a stuffy room. She felt it move through her and rearrange something interior and fundamental. She did not say anything immediately. She let the words sit between them and breathed them in the way you breathe in outside air after being indoors too long. Then she said, "That is the right thing to say. But I need you to understand that trying is not enough if the trying stops the moment it becomes inconvenient. Easy is not what I am asking for. I am asking for real. I am asking for honest. I am asking for someone who will not make decisions about what I can and cannot handle on my behalf." "I understand," he said. "I hope you do," she said, "because I am going to hold you to it." The crisis that Cole Devereux had been building toward arrived not with the drama of a direct confrontation but with the quiet efficiency of a trap well laid. Abraham came into town the following Thursday to collect supplies, as was his regular weekly practice, and when he arrived at the general store run by a man named Horace Webb, he found Sheriff Crane waiting for him with an expression that communicated immediately that the matter at hand was not routine. The situation, as it unfolded, was this. Cole Devereux had spent his days in redemption making conversation with anyone willing to have it, and he had conducted those conversations with such patient and methodical specificity that he had managed to construct, across a dozen casual exchanges, a picture of Abraham Trask that was factually accurate in most of its details and deeply misleading in its overall impression. He had spoken to 3 members of the town council. He had spoken to 2 of the more influential ranchers who grazed cattle on land adjacent to Abraham's property. He had spoken to the man who held the deed on the land Abraham had purchased 14 months ago, a deed which had a particular clause in it regarding the character and lawful standing of the purchaser. The clause, as the deed holder had subsequently determined after consulting with a lawyer in Santa Fe, could be interpreted to mean that the sale was voidable if the purchaser had concealed a material criminal history at the time of purchase. Abraham had not concealed anything, exactly. He had answered the questions he was asked, and had not volunteered what he was not asked about. Whether that constituted concealment was, apparently, a question whose answer depended heavily on who was doing the interpreting. Cole Devereux was not trying to hurt Abraham physically. He was trying to take the ranch. Jane learned this from Sheriff Crane at the same time Abraham did, because she had come into town that same Thursday morning for entirely separate reasons. needing fabric and thread from the general store, and she had arrived to find the two men in conversation outside it, and had read the situation immediately from the quality of Abraham's stillness. The cold calculation of it, the patience and the intelligence and the complete lack of scruple, made her furious in a way that was cleaner and simpler than most of what she had been feeling over the past 2 weeks. This was not complicated. This was wrong. "Who is the deed holder?" she asked Sheriff Crane when he had finished explaining. "Man named Gideon Foss," Crane said. "Helen's husband. He handles the commercial property transactions for most of the county." Jane turned to Abraham. "Did you know Helen Foss's husband held the deed?" "No," Abraham said. "I handled the transaction through a land agent in Santa Fe. I did not know who the ultimate holder was." "Then you need a lawyer," Jane said. "Today." "The nearest lawyer is in Santa Fe," Abraham said. "Then someone needs to ride to Santa Fe today," Jane said. "And that person should probably be you, because you are the one who can explain the transaction from direct knowledge. Is there someone in this town who can manage the ranch for 2 or 3 days while you make that ride?" "Denny and Pio can manage," Abraham said, still with that quality of careful stillness that she was learning to read as his response to unexpected adversity. "Then you should go," she said. He looked at her for a moment in a way that made her feel she was being very carefully seen. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I'm exactly what I told you I was," she replied. "Someone who faces things directly." He rode for Santa Fe that afternoon. Jane stayed in Redemption and did 2 things. First, she went to see Helen Foss at the hotel. The conversation with Helen Foss was remarkable for several reasons, not least of which was that Helen turned out to be a woman of substantially more complexity and moral seriousness than her initial watchful courtesy had suggested. She was also, Jane discovered quickly, as troubled by what her husband was involved in as Jane was. "Gideon did not come to this on his own," Helen told Jane, when they were seated in the small sitting room behind the hotel desk where Helen conducted her private conversations. "Cole Devereaux spent 3 evenings in this hotel and talked to Gideon every one of those evenings. I do not know everything that was said, but I know Gideon is not a man who acts on principle against anyone who has not personally wronged him. He would not move against Abraham Trask on his own." "Devereaux put something in front of him." "Money?" Jane asked. "Possibly," Helen said, "or the promise of it. Devereaux claims he has the rights to the cattle operation that was run on that land before Abraham bought it, which is almost certainly not true but would require proof to disprove. And Gideon is the kind of man who acts first on his own interest and sorts out the complications later." Jane considered this. If Devereaux's claim on the prior cattle operation can be disproven, the basis for challenging the deed collapses. "That would be my understanding," Helen said. "Do you know where that documentation would be?" Helen looked at her with those shrewd blue eyes. "I might have a general sense of where land records for this county are kept," she said. "The land office in Redemption maintains the originals." The land office in Redemption was a single room behind the post office, maintained by a clerk named Aldous Briggs, who was conscientious in the manner of a man who had made the care of records his singular purpose and took it seriously. When Jane appeared at his window and explained what she was looking for, and why, Aldous Briggs looked at her for a long moment over his spectacles, and then said that he was bound by duty to provide access to all public records to any member of the public who presented a legitimate reason for requesting them. Jane spent 4 hours in the Land Records office on a Friday afternoon in October, working through the property history of the parcel now owned by Abraham Trask, and what she found was this. The prior cattle operation, the one Cole Devereaux claimed some right to, had been run by a man named Harlan McCabe who had sold it voluntarily and in full, with no outstanding claims attached, to the land agent in Santa Fe who had subsequently sold it to Abraham. The documentation was complete and clear. Devereaux's claimed connection to McCabe's operation appeared in no record whatsoever. The claim was fabricated from nothing. She made careful copies of the relevant pages, her teacher's handwriting neat and precise in the failing afternoon light, and she put them in her bag alongside the Remington pistol that had been her father's, and that she had carried every day since leaving St. Louis. And she walked back to the hotel with the specific satisfaction of a person who has just taken a trap apart from the inside. Abraham returned from Santa Fe 2 days later with a lawyer named Theodore Aguilar, who had handled property disputes in the territory for 20 years, and who looked at Jane's copied documentation with the expression of a man encountering a Christmas gift he had not expected. "This settles it," Theodore Aguilar said. "Devereaux has no claim. The deed is sound. Any attempt to challenge it in a territorial court will fail, and Devereaux likely knows that, which means the challenge itself was never intended to succeed. It was intended to create enough uncertainty and public doubt to damage Trask's standing in the community." "And has it?" Jane asked. "Some," Abraham said quietly. "There are people who will always prefer to believe the worst." "Then we correct that impression," Jane said, openly and with evidence. The meeting that Sheriff Crane organized at the Redemption Town Hall 2 evenings later was attended by a significant portion of the town's adult population, because in small towns in the territories in 1883, a public dispute about property and character was a matter of genuine community concern. Theodore Aguilar presented the documentation clearly and methodically. Jane stood beside Abraham at the front of the room and answered questions from the town council with a directness that Helen Foss later told her had shifted the room's temperature in a way that no legal argument alone could have managed. Cole Devereaux was in the room. He sat in the back row with his arms folded and his pleasant face arranged in an expression of polite skepticism. And when the presentation was concluded, and the documentation had been examined by the town council members to their apparent satisfaction, he stood and made one final attempt. He said that the documentation was all very well, but that the character of Abraham Trask remained what it was, that a man who had participated in a robbery and caused the deaths of 2 innocent people, regardless of what had been built on top of that history, was not the kind of man a community of decent people should be extending trust to. There was a silence in the room after he said this. Jane stepped forward. She said, "Mr. Devereaux, you have spent the last 2 weeks in this town attempting to construct a case against a man by carefully selecting facts and arranging them to suit a predetermined conclusion. I have spent those same 2 weeks getting to know this community and the people in it, and what I have found is a town that largely already knows Abraham Trask, not the version of him that existed before he served his time, but the version that has been here for over a year, working his land and helping his neighbors and building something worthwhile. You are asking this town to look at a man's worst moment and see nothing else. I would ask this town to look at the whole of him and decide accordingly." She paused, and then she said, "I also want to point out that the man doing the asking has himself served time for the same robbery he is using to condemn someone else, a fact he has carefully avoided mentioning this evening." The room was very quiet. Cole Devereaux looked at her with something in his eyes that was no longer pleasant in any sense, manufactured or otherwise. It was cold and it was assessing, and it was, she thought, the first genuinely honest expression she had seen on his face. He left Redemption the following morning. Sheriff Crane had a quiet conversation with him the night before that he was not forthcoming about in detail, but that he described as clarifying in terms of what the territorial authorities would and would not tolerate as subsequent conduct. Devereaux rode south without drama or farewell, and while Jane understood that a man like that did not simply disappear from the world, the immediate and pressing danger of him receded with the sound of his horse's hooves on the road out of town. In the days that followed, something shifted between Jane and Abraham in a way that felt like a season changing, not dramatic or sudden, but completely genuine and impossible to reverse. He came to Redemption the next Tuesday, not for supplies, but because she had asked to see him, and she met him on the hotel porch where the October sun was warm and the air had the particular crystalline quality of high desert autumn, and she told him that she had made her decision. "I am staying," she said. He was very still. "I am not saying yes to all of it today," she continued, with the precision of a woman who had thought this through carefully. "I am saying yes to continuing what we started. I am saying yes to getting to know you properly, which I feel we have made a reasonable beginning on, but which deserves more time and more ordinary days. I am saying yes to redemption and this territory and the spring and the cottonwoods and the way the mesa looks at sunset." "And me?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment in that October light. "You are the reason I am saying yes to all the rest of it," she said. The expression that moved across his face then was not something she could have described precisely, but it was the most unguarded thing she had yet seen from him, and it was full of something that looked like relief and looked like gratitude and looked like the first cautious arrival of a feeling he had perhaps been afraid to name. He said, "I meant what I said, about trying." "I know," she said. "I am going to hold you to it." He reached across the space between them on that hotel porch and took her hand in both of his, which were warm and calloused and careful, and that was the beginning of the real thing between them, not the letters and not the drama of the past 3 weeks, but this, two people in the autumn light agreeing to try. They spent November getting to know each other in the way that people do when the urgent circumstances have passed, and the ordinary days take over, which is to say in ways that are quieter and more revealing than any crisis could be. Abraham began coming into town twice a week instead of once, and on her days off from the arrangement she had made with the Redemption School Board, which had been desperate enough for a qualified teacher to take her on immediately, she rode out to the ranch in the afternoons and spent time on the property learning its rhythms. She rode with Pio to check the south fence line, and learned from him how to read the signs of cattle stress and what the different qualities of wind meant for tomorrow's weather. She sat with Denny in the evenings while he mended harness leather and listened to his stories about Texas and the drives north and the world before the railroads changed everything. She explored the spring and the cottonwoods and confirmed for herself that the gold of those autumn trees was exactly as Abraham had described it, sharp and sincere and apologetic. She found, in that quiet November, that Abraham was exactly who his letters had suggested he was beneath the things he had withheld. He was intelligent and precise and wryly funny in a way that crept up on you, so that you found yourself laughing at something he had said 3 sentences back when you finally caught up to the implication. He read more than she would have expected, his small library supplemented by volumes borrowed from the territorial subscription library in Santa Fe, and they found that their reading overlapped in several places and diverged in interesting ways, and some of their best conversations happened over books, each of them holding different positions with genuine engagement and genuine respect for the other's argument. He was not always easy. She had known he would not be, and she did not expect him to be, but she found the specific shapes of his difficulty interesting rather than prohibitive. He went quiet sometimes in a way that was not about her and required no management, just patient presence. He had opinions that were strongly held and not always immediately amenable to revision, though they were genuinely amendable if the argument was good enough, which she found was a very different thing from stubbornness in the pejorative sense. He had moments of unexpected tenderness that arrived without announcement and always managed to find her off guard, a hand on her shoulder when she was reading by lamplight, a look across the dinner table when something she said landed somewhere that mattered to him, small and consistent demonstrations of the fact that she was seen. She was also not easy, and she knew it, and she was grateful that he seemed to find the specific shapes of her difficulty interesting in the same way she found his. She had strong opinions of her own, and the kind of directness that could occasionally land harder than she intended. She had a deep independence that was not performative but was genuinely structural, a load-bearing wall in her personality that could not be removed without the whole architecture collapsing, and she needed a partner who understood that and did not treat it as a problem to be solved. Abraham not only understood it, he seemed to find it one of the most reliably interesting things about her. December came in cold and clear, the way high desert winters do, brilliant blue skies and frost on the ground in the mornings, and the smell of wood smoke from every chimney on the Redemption Main Street. Jane had moved from the hotel to a boarding arrangement with Catalina, whose house was warmer and whose cooking was extraordinary, and whose company was exactly the kind Jane needed, warm and forthright and unsentimentally kind. On a December evening when the temperature had dropped sharply and the stars were out in the uncountable numbers that Abraham had written about, he drove into town in the ranch wagon rather than riding, which she had come to understand meant he had brought something he could not carry on horseback. What he had brought was a rocking chair he had made himself, of mesquite wood, smooth and precisely balanced, and he carried it up to her room at Catalina's house with Catalina's amused permission and set it by the window that faced south. "You said you sit and grade papers in the evenings," he said, "and that the straight-backed chair in that room hurts your back after an hour." She looked at the rocking chair and then she looked at him. "You made this," she said. "Over the last 3 weeks," he said, "when I could not sleep." Jane Hawthorne was not a woman who cried easily. She found it uncomfortable and inconvenient, and she had a general preference for containing her emotions in manageable ways. She did not cry now, but something behind her eyes was bright and full in a way that she made no attempt to hide from him. "Abraham," she said. "It is just a chair," he said, with the gruff self-deprecation she had learned was his primary defense against being seen doing something genuinely kind. "It is not just a chair," she said. "You know it is not just a chair." He looked at the chair and then at her, and then he crossed the room and kissed her for the first time, his hands on her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything about the physical landscape of him, the scarred jaw and the calloused hands and the sandstone-cut features, and it was the gentlest thing she had ever experienced. When he stepped back, they were both very quiet for a moment. "I am going to ask you to marry me properly," he said, "when I feel like I have earned the right to." "That is a reasonable position," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. He earned it across the rest of December and into the new year, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulated evidence of his daily self, the person he was in ordinary time, the man who rode 3 extra miles in a January ice storm to bring medicine to Pio's sister in the neighboring settlement, who argued with Jane about land policy and cattle management and the relative merits of different authors, and never once made her feel that losing an argument was a diminishment rather than an exchange, who taught her to shoot with greater accuracy than her amateur handling of the Remington had previously achieved, and who expressed no condescension whatsoever about the state of her existing skills, who told her things about his time at Leavenworth in small, careful installments across the winter evenings, and never made her feel that listening was a burden she should manage differently. In February of 1884, he asked her to marry him. Not with ceremony or elaborate preparation, but sitting on the covered porch of the ranch house in the late afternoon of a day when the sun was warm enough that they had come outside with their coffee, watching the horses in the near pasture, she in the rocker he had brought out for the purpose, and he in a straight-backed chair he had pulled from the kitchen. And he said, quietly and without preamble, "I would like you to be my wife, Jane. If that is something you want." She had known it was coming, in the way that you know a season is changing before the exact moment of change. She had been ready for it in the way that she was ready, which was to say with her whole self engaged and her eyes fully open to what she was agreeing to. She said yes. The wedding was in March, in the Redemption Church, which was a small adobe building with a wooden cross over the door and a minister named Reverend Calloway, who was a practical man in his 60s, and who conducted the ceremony with warmth and without unnecessary length. Helen Foss, who had become something genuine to Jane over the months in redemption, stood with her. Pio and Denny stood with Abraham. Catalina sat in the front row and wept without embarrassment. The whole of Redemption's small community, or most of it, was in attendance, and the reception afterward was held at the hotel and involved Helen Foss's extraordinary cooking and more happiness in a single room than Jane had experienced in one place since she could not precisely remember when. That evening, when they drove back out to the ranch for the first time as a married couple, the sky was full of those stars, the uncountable ones, and Jane sat beside Abraham on the wagon seat with his shoulder warm against hers and looked up at the sky and felt the specific and unrepeatable quality of a life that has found its shape. "You said you could probably read a newspaper by those stars," she said. "I maintain that," he said. "I am going to bring a newspaper out some clear night and we will test it empirically," she told him. "I look forward to it," he said. She could hear the smile in his voice without seeing it. They built their life across the months that followed with the same combination of deliberate effort and genuine ease that had characterized everything between them since that first breakfast at the hotel. Jane continued teaching at the Redemption School. Abraham's cattle operation expanded modestly, and the kitchen garden that had never quite flourished for him began to flourish for her, because she had a particular patience with growing things that he admired and adopted some of from observation. The extra room at the back of the house, the one built for whatever the future required, became first a proper library with 2 full shelves of books, and then, in the late autumn of 1884, was quietly redesigned with different furniture and softer light. In the spring of 1885, Jane gave birth to a boy. They named him Samuel, after her father, which was her idea, and James as a middle name, after no one in particular, but because it sounded like a name that would serve a person well across different kinds of days. Abraham held his son with an expression that was beyond anything Jane had words for, and she watched him from the bed where she was still recovering, and she thought about the man who had written to her about stars and cottonwoods and the difficulty of being who he was, and she felt something so full and so complete that it pressed against the interior of her chest with physical weight. "He looks like you," she told him. Abraham looked up from the baby. "He looks like a very small and deeply surprised person," he said. "Yes," Jane agreed. "That is what I said." Samuel was a person of strong opinions from remarkably early, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He had Abraham's dark eyes and Jane's particular quality of attending very carefully to everything that happened around him before rendering judgment. He was a good-natured and robust child, and the ranch absorbed him the way good land absorbs good rain, completely and with evident appreciation. Denny taught him to whistle when he was barely 2, which Jane considered an arguable contribution to domestic peace. Pio showed him how to braid grass stems, and the learning of this skill produced a period of several weeks during which every surface in the house was decorated with small woven shapes. Abraham read to him every evening, and Jane graded papers at the desk beside the window, while the sound of Abraham's voice filled the room with stories, and she sometimes looked up from her work and across at the 2 of them in the lamplight, and felt the specific gravity of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Cole Devereaux came back into their lives exactly once more, in the summer of 1886, not in person, but in the form of a legal notice delivered to the ranch by a courier from Santa Fe. He had apparently made one final attempt to revive his property claim through a different legal avenue, this one involving some argument about the original 1876 case and the conditions of Abraham's cooperation with federal authorities. Theodore Aguilar, who had remained in contact with Abraham as a professional associate and something approaching a friend, disposed of it efficiently, and with a quality of finality that suggested even Cole Devereux had finally understood the futility of the enterprise. There was no further communication after that. Whatever Cole Devereux did with his energy and his grievances in the years after, he directed them elsewhere, and the Trask Ranch in Redemption, New Mexico, continued undisturbed. The summer of 1886 brought other things more worth remembering. Abraham fenced the new south pasture and expanded the herd. Jane established a small lending library at the school, using her own book collection as the founding stock, which was, she told Abraham, the most genuinely useful thing she had ever done with her personal property. The spring behind the ranch produced particularly cold and clear water that summer, and she and Abraham spent several evenings in the late heat of August sitting beside it with their feet in the water and talking about everything and nothing, the way that couples who have become each other's closest company do, in the comfortable wandering manner of two minds that have learned each other's rhythms. On one of those evenings, Abraham said something that she thought about for a long time afterward. He said, "I think about what I was sometimes, the 22-year-old version of myself. I do not think he was a fundamentally bad person. I think he was a person with no anchor and no purpose, and the specific kind of empty confidence that fills up in young men when nothing real has yet tested them. I think he would have found his way eventually, with or without the choices that ended him in Leavenworth. But I think the choices and the consequences and the 8 years of working out exactly who he wanted to be afterward, I think those gave him something that the slower route might not have. I think they gave him a quality of intention that he might otherwise have arrived at accidentally." Jane listened to this and said, "Do you think you would have found me without all of that, the slower route?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything seriously. "No," he said. "I think the version of me that avoided all of that would have wanted someone easier, and I think that would have been his loss." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am not easy either," she said. "No," he agreed, and she heard the warmth in it. "You are absolutely not. It is one of the best things about you." In the autumn of 1887, Jane discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was different from the first, harder in the early months, and she spent several weeks that fall feeling considerably more mortal than she generally preferred to feel. Abraham was present through all of it with a quiet and practical attentiveness that she had come to understand was how he expressed the things that were deepest in him, not through words, which he used carefully and economically, but through the consistent evidence of action. He took over the kitchen completely during the period when the smell of cooking made her ill, teaching himself a repertoire of foods she could tolerate with a methodical determination that Denny found enormously entertaining and Pio found entirely natural. He managed the school board communication when she needed to arrange her leave with more diplomatic skill than she had expected from a man who generally expressed his opinions with very little regard for social navigation, which told her he was making a conscious and considerable effort. He sat beside her on the porch in the evenings when she felt well enough to be outside, and he read to her from whatever book was current, and those evenings were among the things she would afterward count among the best of her life. The October stars coming out above the high desert while his voice moved through the pages of a novel or a history, or, on one occasion, a long technical document about cattle breed improvement that he insisted was actually quite interesting, and which she fell asleep to. Not because it was not interesting, but because the sound of his voice was the most reliably comfortable thing she had ever known. Their second child was born in the spring of 1888. This one was a girl, which did not surprise either of them somehow. They named her Clara after Abraham's mother, who had died when he was 12, and whom he had mentioned only a handful of times in all their years together, but always with a quality of feeling that told Jane she had mattered profoundly in the short time she was present. Clara was born with a head of dark hair, and a voice that announced her arrival into the world with considerable authority, and Samuel, who was 3 years old and had been prepared for this new person with great care by both parents, pronounced her acceptable at his first introduction, which was the best possible endorsement given his general standards. The years between 1888 and 1892 were what Jane would later call the good ordinary years, and she meant it entirely without condescension, because she had come to understand that good ordinary was one of the rarest and most valuable things a life could produce. The children grew. The ranch prospered in a modest and sustainable way. The school at Redemption expanded its enrollment as the territory's population grew, and Jane taught 4 days a week, and spent the fifth at the ranch managing the garden and the accounts, and the particular administrative complexity of 2 children at different stages of the same persistent energy. Redemption grew around them, new families arriving, a proper doctor establishing a practice, a second church, a bank, the slow and noisy construction of civic life that came with a community gaining confidence in its own permanence. Abraham Trask was, by 1891, a man of some standing in that community, which was something he managed with the particular discomfort of a person who had never expected to be looked up to and was not entirely sure he deserved it. When the town council asked him to serve as a member, he consulted Jane for 3 days before agreeing, and then served with the same combination of directness and genuine fairness that characterized everything he did. He had no talent for the political aspects of public life, the management of competing interests, and the necessary diplomatic softening of direct positions, but the town had Theodore Aguilar and 2 other men who handled that, and what it needed from Abraham was the straightforward application of good judgment without agenda, which he could provide reliably. Jane watched him in that role as she had watched him in everything, with the attention of a person who found the subject genuinely fascinating and was in no danger of running out of things to observe. He was still not easy. He had never claimed he would become easy, only that he would try to be, and she thought that the trying was the real thing, not the becoming. She was still not easy herself. They had arguments, real ones, across the years, the kind that required the application of genuine effort to resolve, and they resolved them, not perfectly or instantly but consistently and honestly, because they had both decided at the beginning that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. On a summer evening in 1892, they went out behind the ranch after the children were in bed, carrying a lantern and a copy of the Redemption Weekly Gazette, and they stood by the spring in the cottonwood dark with the stars doing their impossible work overhead, and Jane held the newspaper at arm's length in the starlight. She could not read the print, not quite, but the headings were legible just, and she held the paper up and showed Abraham and said, "You were almost right." He stood beside her and looked at the paper and then at the sky and then at her, and he laughed. It was a full sound, not his usual brief and quietly amused response to something, but a genuine and complete laugh, and she thought it was one of the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard, because it was the sound of a man who was present in his own life without reservation. "Next clearer night," he said. "We will need a different angle to the south," she said, professionally considering the problem. "Then we will find a different angle," he said. Samuel, who was 7 years old and had excellent hearing and a complete inability to stay in bed when interesting things were happening, appeared at the edge of the cottonwoods in his nightshirt and announced that he wanted to see. Jane and Abraham looked at each other. "Come here," Abraham said, and Samuel ran across the dark grass and was scooped up onto his father's shoulders, where he held the newspaper up toward the stars with the pure and uncomplicated faith of a child who has no reason to believe a thing will not work. Clara's voice drifted from the house, asking where Samuel was. Jane walked back toward the light. The 3 of them, her husband with their son on his shoulders beneath the uncountable stars, the light of the lantern moving through the dark grass ahead of her, the sound of her daughter's voice from the house, and the sound of Abraham telling Samuel to hold the paper steady, the smell of the high desert night, and the faint cold of the spring moving through the air. all of it so complete and so particular that she felt it as something physical, a pressure of the real world bearing down with its full and extraordinary weight. She had come here from Missouri with a Remington pistol and a trunk of practical clothing and a letter from a man who had written beautifully about stars and had not told her the truth about who he was. She had pointed that pistol at his chest in the doorway of a sheriff's office and listened to him say he was not easy and that she made him want to try to be. She had known, in the moment he said it, that it was the most honest thing he had ever offered anyone. She stopped at the edge of the cottonwoods and looked back at him in the starlight. He had set Samuel down, and the boy was holding the newspaper by himself now, aimed at the sky, squinting at it with the focused application of someone who has inherited a scientific tendency, and Abraham was watching her, the way he had watched her from the beginning, with those dark, careful eyes that had always seen her more completely than she expected to be seen. "It works," Samuel announced with great authority. "I can see the words." "Of course you can," Abraham said, still looking at Jane. She walked back to them, and when she reached them she took Abraham's hand in hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers the way he always had, with both of his, warm and calloused and gentle. "Papa," Samuel said, still holding the newspaper aloft, "when I grow up, I am going to read every single newspaper ever written by Starlight." "That is an ambitious program," Abraham said. "I know," Samuel agreed, entirely untroubled by this. Jane leaned her head briefly against Abraham's shoulder. The stars were outrageous and beautiful and impossible, just as he had promised they would be. The house waited behind them with Clara in it, and their books on the shelves, and the rocking chair by the window that he had made in the nights when he could not sleep, because she was coming from Missouri, and he was afraid that what he was would be too much for what she might be. The kitchen garden and the spring, and the 400 acres of mesquite and grass and red rock that they had tended together for nearly a decade. The neighbors who had become friends, and the town that had become home, and the life that had been built, carefully and honestly and without shortcuts, from the unpromising materials of two people who knew very clearly that they were not easy and had decided to try anyway. There is something to be said for trying. Jane Hawthorne Trask knew this better than most. She had left everything familiar to come to a place she had never seen, on the strength of letters from a man she did not know, because something in those letters had spoken to something in her that recognized itself. She had been right to come. She had been right to stay when it would have been simpler to go. She had been right about all of it, not because things had been uncomplicated or painless or without genuine risk, but because real and difficult and worth it were not mutually exclusive conditions. They were more often than not the same condition by different names. Abraham Trask had tried. He had tried every day of their life together not to become easy, but to become known, which was both harder and more important. He had let himself be seen, the whole of him, the dark past and the difficult temperament and the unexpected tenderness and the way he wrote about stars, and she had looked at the whole of him and chosen him with full knowledge and without reservation, and he had done the same for her. That is what it is to be loved, not to be idealized, to be known and chosen anyway. Samuel lowered the newspaper and looked at his parents with the frank assessment of a child who is attending to something. "You are doing the thing where you look at each other," he said. "Yes," Jane agreed. "Mama does it a lot," he told Abraham, as if imparting useful information. "I know," Abraham said, and the corner of his mouth moved upward. "So do you," Samuel said. Abraham looked at his son with those dark eyes and then at his wife, and he did not argue the point. Jane took Samuel by the hand, and Abraham took her other one, and the three of them walked back through the October dark toward the light of the house, where Clara was waiting, and the books were on the shelves, and the life they had made together was in every corner and every room, in the chair by the window and the well-tended garden and the photographs on the sitting-room wall, in all the particular evidence of two people who had agreed to try and had found in the trying something more durable and more extraordinary than easy ever could have been. The cottonwoods turned their gold in the dark behind them. The stars burned steady and uncountable overhead. And redemption. New Mexico settled into the good, ordinary night of a town that has made its peace with the past and is building, as such towns do, toward whatever comes next.